On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union sealed West Berlin, cutting every road, rail line, and canal into the city and shutting off the electricity. More than 2 million people were trapped over 100 miles inside Soviet territory with a few weeks of food and coal left. The Western Allies responded with an airlift that flew supplies into the city for 15 months, around the clock, through winter fog, guided to the ground by radio. But guiding planes was only one part of what radio did during the Berlin airlift, and the rest of the story explains why the blockade ultimately failed. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the four Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, divided the country into occupation zones. Berlin itself was carved into 4 sectors, one for each power, even though the entire city sat deep inside the Soviet zone. For about 3 years, the arrangement held. Western supply convoys crossed Soviet territory on agreed routes, and the 4 powers shared administrative control of the German capital. But post-war cooperation between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was eroding steadily as Cold War tensions escalated across Europe. In June 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency called the Deutsche Mark into their occupation zones and into West Berlin as part of a broader effort to rebuild the West German economy. Moscow saw this as a direct provocation, a step toward creating a permanent Western-aligned German state on its border, and the Soviet leadership decided to force a confrontation. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces shut down every route into West Berlin, halting all rail traffic, turning back road convoys, and closing the canals. Electricity supplied from Soviet zone power stations was switched off at the same time. It was the first major international crisis of the Cold War, and it was designed to work through starvation and isolation. Stalin's objective was to pressure the Western Allies into abandoning both their plans for a separate West German state and their presence in Berlin altogether. If West Berlin couldn't feed itself, the reasoning went, the West would either negotiate on Soviet terms or be forced to leave. The Soviets had geography and logistics on their side. West Berlin had somewhere around 2 to 2.5 million residents, and only a few weeks of stockpiled food and coal when the blockade began. The Western Allies had limited time and no option that didn't carry enormous risk. Forcing an armed convoy through Soviet territory might trigger a military confrontation nobody wanted. Abandoning the city would hand the Soviets a massive strategic and propaganda victory. President Harry Truman chose a third path. 3 narrow air corridors into Berlin had been agreed upon between the Allies and the Soviets before the blockade, and those corridors were still legally open to Allied aircraft. On June 26, 1948, just 2 days after the blockade started, the first American C-47 transport planes landed at Tempelhof Airfield in West Berlin. The Americans called the effort Operation Vittles. The British called their parallel operation Plainfare. Between them, they set out to feed and supply an entire city from the air. The early weeks were grim. Military planners calculated that West Berlin needed roughly 4,500 tons of supplies per day to survive, covering food, coal for heating and electricity generation, and essential raw materials. The initial flights delivered only a fraction of that. Aircraft were too few, the logistics were improvised on the fly, and approaches into Berlin's airfields were dangerously uncoordinated. In the summer of 1948, General William Tunner took command of the day-to-day airlift operations. Tunner had organized the wartime hump airlift over the Himalayas, flying supplies to China across some of the most dangerous terrain on the planet. And he understood mass air logistics better than almost anyone in the military. He imposed strict scheduling, standardized flight procedures, and one-way traffic patterns inside the air corridors that began to push delivery numbers steadily upward. The incident that forced the biggest overhaul came on August 13, 1948, a day the airlift crews called Black Friday. In poor weather over Tempelhof, a crash and multiple near collisions on approach exposed exactly how dangerous the existing system was. After Black Friday, Tunner mandated that all aircraft fly standardized, radar-guided approaches rather than relying on individual pilot judgment. The improvised operation became a disciplined machine. But the airlift had a physical bottleneck. The existing airfields in West Berlin simply could not handle enough planes to meet the city's daily needs. The answer was a third airfield, built from nothing in the French sector at a site called Tegel. Construction began in early August 1948, with a workforce of around 19,000 Berlin civilians laboring in shifts around the clock. The first aircraft landed at Tegel on November 5, 1948, roughly 90 days after construction started, and the runway they built was the longest in Europe at the time. While Tunner was turning the airlift into a precision logistics operation in the sky, something equally critical was happening on the radio frequencies below. In late 1945, the U.S. military administration in Berlin tried to get airtime on the existing Berlin radio station, which was controlled by Soviet authorities. The Soviets refused, so the Americans built their own broadcasting operation. It began transmitting on February 7, 1946, initially carried only by telephone wire under the name DIAS, short for Drahtfunk im Amerikanischen Sektor, meaning wired radio in the American sector. Later that year, around September 1946, a medium-wave transmitter came online, and the station was renamed RIAS, Rundfunk im Amerikanischen Sektor, radio in the American sector. When the blockade began, RIAS became the voice of West Berlin. It broadcast airlift developments in real time. How many flights had come in? How many tons of supplies had been delivered? What was happening on the corridors? This was not just a convenience. The alternative source of information was Berliner Rundfunk, the Soviet-controlled station, which was pumping out propaganda intended to undermine confidence in the airlift and in the Western Allies. For the population of West Berlin, choosing what station to listen to meant choosing whose version of reality to believe. RIAS also broadcast American and West German popular music and jazz, the same genres that Nazi authorities had previously suppressed. This was a deliberate cultural strategy, and it worked. The music created a bond between West Berliners and the Western powers that went beyond news bulletins and cargo manifests, and it gave the blockaded city a soundtrack of defiance. Ernst Reuter, West Berlin's mayor-elect, used both mass rallies and radio broadcasts to hold the civilian population together through months of rationing, cold, and uncertainty. His defining moment came on September 9, 1948, when he stood before the burned-out Reichstag building and addressed a crowd of 300,000 people with an appeal that was carried by radio far beyond the city. He urged the world not to abandon West Berlin, and that broadcast turned a local crisis into an international cause. But broadcast radio was only one half of the story. The other half, the one that kept every plane in the air from crashing, was the radar and radio navigation infrastructure that made round-the-clock flying physically possible. Berlin's winters brought dense fog, low cloud ceilings, and visibility conditions that would have shut down any normal flying operation. The airlift could not stop every time the weather closed in, which in Berlin was frequently. The system that solved this problem was called Ground Controlled Approach, or GCA. In a GCA landing, ground-based radar operators tracked each incoming aircraft on their scopes and guided the pilot to the runway entirely by voice, over the radio, calling out altitude corrections, heading adjustments, and distance to the threshold step by step, often without the pilot ever seeing the ground until the last seconds before touchdown. GCA units were expanded at Tempelhof and the other airfields specifically for the airlift. Combined with radio navigation beacons that helped aircraft hold their assigned courses along the narrow corridors, this equipment allowed planes to land at intervals as tight as every 30 to 90 seconds at peak, day and night, through weather that pre-airlift aviation would have considered unflyable. The entire operation depended on continuous radio contact between pilots, ground controllers at each airfield, and the multinational Berlin Air Safety Center, which had the added task of deconflicting Allied flights with Soviet air defense authorities over corridors that passed directly through Soviet-controlled airspace. Every flight into West Berlin was, in practical terms, a radio-coordinated transit through hostile territory. There's a reason aviation historians still study these procedures. The ground-controlled approach techniques refined under pressure during the Berlin airlift became a direct precursor to the civilian and military instrument landing and air traffic control systems used worldwide today. And then there was the most literal confrontation between radio infrastructure and the blockade itself. When the new airfield at Tegel was completed in the French sector, a set of Soviet-controlled radio transmission towers near the site turned out to be physically obstructing the flight approach path to the runway. French authorities asked the Soviets to remove the towers. The Soviets ignored the request. On December 16, 1948, French Commandant General Jean Ganneval ordered the towers demolished with explosives. When his furious Soviet counterpart demanded to know how such a thing was possible, Ganneval reportedly replied, "With dynamite, my dear colleague." The Soviets protested, but the towers were gone and Tegel's approach path stayed clear. In the summer of 1948, while the tonnage numbers were still climbing and the outcome of the blockade was far from certain, an American pilot stationed at one of the airlift bases noticed something that had nothing to do with cargo manifests or radar screens. Lieutenant Gail Halverson saw groups of Berlin children gathering along the fence at Tempelhof to watch the planes land. He promised them he would drop candy the next time he flew in and told them to watch for the plane that wiggled its wings so they would know which one was his. Halverson started dropping small bundles of candy tied to handkerchief parachutes from his aircraft on approach. When his commanding officers discovered what he was doing, they didn't shut it down. They expanded it into an officially sanctioned program called Operation Little Vittles. The story spread to the American public, and school children and candy manufacturers across the United States began donating supplies. Over the course of the airlift, more than 250,000 candy parachutes were dropped over Berlin, carrying a total of more than 20 tons of sweets. Halverson earned the nicknames Candy Bomber and Uncle Wiggly Wings, and he remained a celebrated figure for the rest of his life, passing away on February 16, 2022, in Provo, Utah, at the age of 101. The airlift extracted a real cost in human lives. Depending on how the count is conducted and which nationalities and roles are included, military crew, civilian workers, and ground casualties are tallied differently across different records. The total falls somewhere between roughly 70 and just over 100 people killed during the operation. Any single number would be misleading, But what doesn't change across any methodology is that dozens of people died keeping West Berlin supplied from the air. By the spring of 1949, the airlift had demonstrated something that the Soviet leadership had not anticipated. The operation was sustainable, and it showed no signs of stopping. On April 15th and 16th, 1949, the airlift staged a maximum effort push nicknamed the Easter Parade. Over the course of 24 hours, crews delivered a record 12,941 tons of coal to West Berlin, a deliberate demonstration that the blockade could not outlast the airlift. Less than a month later, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. Just after midnight on May 12, 1949, the roads, railways, and canals into West Berlin reopened. Allied countermeasures restricting strategic exports to the Eastern Bloc had added their own economic pressure, and the Soviet leadership concluded that the blockade had failed to achieve any of its objectives. The airlift itself continued for several more months as a precaution, in case the Soviets tried to reimpose restrictions. The final official flights were logged on September 30th, 1949. By that point, Allied aircraft had completed roughly 277,000 to 278,000 flights into West Berlin and delivered more than 2.3 million tons of supplies at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. The Berlin airlift reshaped the post-war order. The crisis accelerated the formation of NATO in April 1949 and contributed to the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany later that year. For the residents of West Berlin, the experience transformed their relationship with the Western Allies from one of occupied population and occupying army to something closer to mutual defense. The airlift planes that had been instruments of war 3 years earlier became instruments of survival, and the radio signals that held the entire operation together left a legacy of their own. Every radar-guided instrument approach into a fogged-in airport, every voice-directed landing sequence at a congested terminal today traces part of its lineage back to the GCA operators who talked cargo planes onto the runway at Tempelhof through the Berlin winter of 1948. RIAS itself kept broadcasting for decades after the blockade, remaining one of the most recognized voices of the West in divided Berlin throughout the Cold War. The blockade was designed to silence West Berlin, but radio kept it talking.